The morning they sold Eleanor Voss for $38 and a mule, the Colorado sky was the color of a bruise. She had not cried. She had decided, somewhere between the moment her stepfather's hand closed around her wrist and the moment he shoved the paper contract across the wooden table toward the mining camp foreman, that she would not give either of them the satisfaction of her tears. She was 22 years old, trained in her mother's kitchen since she could stand on a stool and reach the stove, and apparently worth less than the saddle strapped to the back of that gray mule. She kept her chin level and her dark eyes dry, and she memorized the face of every man in that room, because Eleanor Voss had always believed, with a stubbornness that bordered on holy conviction, that the world eventually corrected its own cruelties. It was the autumn of 1872, and the silver rush had turned the Colorado Rockies into a landscape of desperation and greed. Towns appeared overnight and disappeared by spring, their skeletal frames left to rot in the mountain passes like the carcasses of great animals. Men came from everywhere, from Missouri and Kentucky and even from across the ocean, drawn by stories of fortunes buried in the earth. They came with their pickaxes and their ambitions in their rough hands, and they needed to eat, and they needed someone to cook for them. And apparently the most efficient solution anyone in Hatchet Creek could devise was to purchase a woman outright and set her to the stove. The camp was called the Monarch, and it sat 4 miles east of the town of Hatchet Creek, nestled against the base of a gray granite ridge that blocked the morning sun until nearly 10 o'clock. There were 43 men working that camp, and their foreman was a heavyset man named Gerald Drum, who had the kind of eyes that calculated everything they landed on, weighing cost against value with the practiced indifference of a man who had spent too long in places where human beings were treated as inventory. Eleanor arrived in the back of a wagon, seated beside a crate of canned goods and a broken pickaxe handle, and when Drum helped her down, it was with the efficiency of a man unloading freight. "You cook 3 meals a day," he said, not looking at her, his eyes already moving toward the ridge where the sounds of hammering echoed down the stone. "Breakfast before 6, midday meal at noon, supper at 7. You clean the cookhouse. You do not go near the bunkhouses after dark. You do not leave the camp without my say-so. You understand all that?" "I understand you," Eleanor said, and the way she said it made him look at her then, just briefly, with something that might have been surprise. The cookhouse was a low building of raw timber and pine, still leaking sap from the cut ends of the logs, smelling of resin and wood smoke. The stove was a good one, a cast-iron Monarch range that struck Eleanor as deeply ironic given the name of the camp. There were pots and pans hung on iron hooks along one wall, a wood box that needed filling, a flour barrel, and a small window above the work table that looked out onto the granite ridge. Eleanor stood in the center of that kitchen for a long moment, taking its measure, and then she rolled up her sleeves and she went to work. She was good at it. She had always been good at it, and some part of her took grim satisfaction in that competence, even under the worst circumstances. Her biscuits were light and golden. Her venison stew was rich with wild herbs she learned to gather from the hillsides on the rare occasions she was allowed outside the camp perimeter. She made sourdough bread that the miners tore into with a kind of reverence, and she made a dried apple pie that reduced 2 grown men to something approaching genuine gratitude. The camp ate well, and Gerald Drum said nothing beyond a grunt of acknowledgement, which she understood to be the highest compliment he was capable of producing. But the work was relentless, and the loneliness was a different kind of weight altogether. The men were not cruel to her, most of them. They were rough and dirty and largely indifferent, but there was a respect in the way they moved around her kitchen, a careful distance that suggested they understood at some level that the situation was wrong, even if none of them would say so. A young man from Tennessee named Billy Coates sometimes thanked her properly, hat in hand, color rising in his neck, and she appreciated it in the way you appreciate small lights in dark places. She had been at the Monarch for 6 weeks when the trouble started. It began with the arrival of a man named Silas Cross, who came to the camp as a new investor, and who brought with him 2 other men, and the kind of restless, possessive energy that Eleanor had learned to recognize and fear. Drum seemed smaller when Cross was around, the foreman's bluster deflating to a kind of eager compliance that turned Eleanor's stomach. Cross walked through the cookhouse on his second day at the camp and looked at Eleanor the way Drum had looked at her that first day in the wagon, like freight, like inventory. And then he smiled at her in a way that was far worse than indifference. "Fine arrangement you've got here, Drum," Cross said, and Eleanor kept her eyes on the bread dough she was working and her hands moving steadily, betraying nothing. After that, she began thinking seriously about escape. The problem was the mountains. It was October now, and the passes were closing. The town of Hatchet Creek was 4 miles through dense pine forest, and she had no horse and no gun and no money and no one there who would help her. Her mother was dead, 3 years gone from a fever, and her stepfather had made his position abundantly clear. She had no family she could reach before winter sealed the high country. She was, as far as the practical world was concerned, stuck. She thought about it every night, lying on her narrow cot in the small room off the cookhouse, listening to the wind come down off the granite ridge. She was not without courage. She was not without intelligence. But courage and intelligence require opportunity, and opportunity had not yet presented itself. It presented itself in a form she had not expected. The first Saturday of November, a group of men from town came to the camp to play cards. It was a common enough event she had gathered from the talk among the miners, Drum hosting a poker game once or twice a month that served as both entertainment and a way of doing business with the men who supplied the camp. Eleanor was expected to provide food and coffee for the evening, and she moved through the main room of the cookhouse, refilling cups and setting out plates of cornbread and cold sliced venison, largely invisible to the 8 men arranged around the table. She was pouring coffee when she first saw him. He had come in late, ducking through the low doorway with the instinctive care of a man who had spent a long time in structures not built for his height. He was enormous, not in the soft way of men who ate well and sat still, but in the way of something that had been shaped by hard work and harder weather, all of it converted into muscle that moved under his flannel shirt with a quality that was almost alarming. His shoulders were broad enough that he had to turn slightly sideways to get through the interior door, and when he straightened to his full height inside the room, he seemed to reduce the space available to everyone else without any effort or intention. His hair was dark and long enough to brush his collar, pushed back carelessly from a face that was all hard angles and strong bones, weathered brown by sun and altitude. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and dark eyes that moved around the room with a quiet attentiveness that noticed everything and announced nothing. He sat down at the far end of the table and said almost nothing for the first hour, just played his cards with a calm that seemed to unsettle the men around him the way a quiet horse unsettles skittish ones. His name, she gathered from the conversation, was Callum Holt. He had been in the Colorado Rockies for 4 years, trapping and hunting, and apparently doing very well at both, and he came to Hatchet Creek twice a year to sell pelts and resupply, and it seemed to play poker. Silas Cross arrived an hour into the game, flushed and loud and carrying a bottle, and the temperature of the room changed the way a room changes when someone brings in cold air from outside, except that it was not cold. He brought with him but something hotter and less comfortable. He sat down heavily, bought into the game with a carelessness about money that announced he had too much of it, and his eyes found Eleanor immediately. She refilled cups and kept moving. The game went on for 3 hours. Eleanor stayed because Drum had told her to stay, because the coffee needed keeping hot and the men needed feeding, and because she had nowhere to go and nothing to do in her small room except lie awake thinking about the walls closing in. She watched the game without appearing to watch it, from the corner of her eye, from the periphery of her attention, and she noticed that Callum Holt won with a consistency that was almost quiet, raking in small pots steadily, never ostentatious, never crowing, just accumulating. She also noticed that he watched Cross the way she watched Cross, with that same careful peripheral attention, and she had the fleeting thought that perhaps she was not the only one in the room who had learned to take the measure of dangerous men. It was past midnight when Cross turned to Drum with the loose, confident air of a man who had been drinking steadily and had moved past caution into territory that felt to him like inspiration. "I want to play for the girl," Cross said. The room went quiet. It was the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that presses down on the people inside it. Eleanor stopped moving. She was standing near the stove, and she set the coffee pot down carefully on the cast iron surface, and she kept her face absolutely still. She had been in this country long enough to know what was possible, and still the baldness of it struck her like cold water. Drum hesitated. She watched him calculate, watched him weigh Cross's money against whatever small instinct for decency he might have possessed, and she watched decency lose. "She is under contract to the camp," Drum said, but he said it in the tone of a man already composing his acceptance. "Contracts can be bought," Cross said. He pulled out a fold of paper money that made several men at the table shift in their seats. $200 for her contract. The young miner, Billy Coates, stared at the table and said nothing, and Eleanor felt something harden inside her chest like stone cooling. "I will raise that," said Callum Holt. His voice was quiet and even, carrying no particular emphasis, as if he were raising a bet on any other hand. But the effect in the room was significant. Several men turned to look at him. Cross turned to look at him, and the calculation in Cross's eyes sharpened to something more focused. "250, Holt said. Cross smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "This is not a poker hand, Holt." "Is it not?" Holt said. He picked up his cards and set them down again with a small, precise movement. "Drum said he will consider it. I am considering it too. Deal me in, or tell me I cannot bid, and give me a reason that will satisfy me." The last words were said with a softness that was somehow more consequential than shouting would have been. Gerald Drum looked at Cross, and Cross looked at Holt, and the room held its breath. "Play for it," Cross said finally. His voice had taken on an edge of interest, the edge of a man who wanted to win something specifically because someone else had challenged him for it. 5-card draw. High hand wins her contract. Eleanor understood, with a cold and perfectly lucid clarity, that she was being treated as a pot to be won, that her freedom was being staked on the turn of cards, that the dignity of the situation was nowhere present. She also understood, in the same crystalline moment, that this was the opportunity she had been waiting for, and that it had come wearing a face she had not imagined. The hand was dealt by Billy Coates, who was the only man in the room whose hands were trembling. The other players folded one by one, sensing what this had become, leaving only Cross and Holt in the hand. The pot on the table held $250 in paper money, the folded contract that bore Eleanor's name, and something less tangible but more significant, which was the answer to what kind of place this camp was going to be and what kind of man was going to prevail in it. Cross drew 2 cards. Holt drew 1. Holt laid his hand on the table. 3 kings and 2 sevens, a full house assembled with the same quiet efficiency with which he seemed to do everything. Cross looked at the cards for a long moment, and then he looked at his own hand, which held a pair of aces and a scattered confusion of low cards, and he set them down face up with the careful deliberateness of a man keeping himself from other actions. "Well played," Cross said, and his voice was flat and smooth and entirely without sincerity, and Eleanor registered that he was a man who would not forget this. Callum Holt gathered the paper money and the contract, and then he stood up from the table to his full height, and he looked at Eleanor for the first time, directly, across the room, and the thing in his dark eyes was not possession and was not triumph. It was something she did not immediately have a word for, though she would find one later. It looked, she thought, very much like recognition. He crossed the room to where she stood by the stove, and he held the contract out to her. "This is yours," he said. She looked at the folded paper in his hand, and then up at his face, and she searched it for the trap, for the catch, for the part where freedom revealed itself as a different kind of cage. She had learned to look for those things. She had been taught by experience to look for those things. Just like that," she said. "Just like that," he said. "You are not anyone's property. You are a free woman. What you do next is your own business." She took the contract from his hand, and she held it for a moment, feeling its weight, which was negligible and enormous at once. Then she crossed to the stove, lifted the iron door, and fed it into the fire. She stood there and watched it burn until there was nothing left of it but ash, and the room was very quiet around her, and when she turned back, Callum Holt was still standing where she had left him, watching her with those dark, attentive eyes. "I do not have anywhere to go," she said. She said it plainly, because she was a woman who had learned to deal plainly with facts. "It is November. The passes are closing. I have no money and no horse. I know, he said. I have a place if you would accept it. A cabin about 12 miles north, up toward the Sangre de Cristo foothills. You would have your own room and your own space, and I would not make any demands of you that you did not choose. He paused. But I understand if that is not a thing you are willing to trust. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. She was not naive, and she was not reckless, but she was also not a woman who could afford to refuse the only door that had opened. I will go with you, she said, and if you prove yourself a liar, you will find out that I know how to handle a skillet and a man's expectations both. Something moved through his expression, too fast and complicated to name. It might have been a smile. It might have been something deeper. That seems fair, he said. They left before dawn, before Cross had a chance to recover his equanimity and decide that the card game had not been the final word on the matter. Holt had 2 horses, a big gray gelding he rode himself, and a smaller bay he had brought into camp as a pack horse, and he put Eleanor on the bay with his bedroll strapped behind her and his spare rifle across the saddle. She was wearing her wool coat and her heaviest skirt and a pair of boots that were slightly too large but serviceable, and when they rode out of the Monarch camp in the cold dark before sunrise, she did not look back. The ride north took most of the day. The trail wound through dense pine forest and across 2 frozen creek beds, climbing steadily into the higher country where the air thinned and the sky darkened to a blue so pure and cold it looked like something you could cut yourself on. Callum led and she followed, and he rode with the ease of a man who knew every tree in this country, which she suspected was not far from the truth. They stopped at mid-morning to water the horses at a place where a spring ran out from under a shelf of granite, still flowing in a thin, clear trickle despite the cold, and he handed her a strip of dried venison without ceremony, and she took it without ceremony, and they stood for a few minutes in the pine-scented silence while the horses drank. "How long have you been in Colorado?" she asked. "Since '68, he said. 4 years. "Where before that?" "Montana," he said. "Before that, Pennsylvania." "You're a long way from Pennsylvania." "So are you," he said, glancing at her. "Illinois," she said. "I came out with my stepfather 2 years ago. He had ideas about the territory." She paused. They were not good ideas. Callum said nothing for a moment, which she appreciated. Men who said too much too fast in response to pain made her feel like a performance rather than a person. "He is the one who contracted you to the camp," Callum said finally. It was not a question. "For $38 and a mule," she said. She said it with a flatness that was not indifference, but was the closest thing to control she had over a story that still had the power to ambush her. Callum's jaw tightened. She saw it, that small movement in the hard architecture of his face, and something about it, the restraint of it, the fact that he absorbed the information and held it rather than performing outrage, made her trust him a fraction more. "I am sorry," he said, and he said it as if he meant it rather than as a social reflex, and she believed him. They rode on. The cabin was everything she had not let herself expect. It sat in a clearing on the east slope of a long forested ridge, backed against a stand of tall spruce that broke the north wind, looking out over a valley that in summer, she would later learn, was filled with wildflowers. In November, it was a landscape of snow and gray timber, and the occasional dark shape of a deer moving through the tree line, and the cabin itself was solidly built of thick pine logs with a good stone chimney, a real glass window on the south side that caught the afternoon light, and a covered porch where 3 sets of animal hides hung drying in the cold air. It was not large, but it was sound. There was one main room with the fireplace and the table, and a bench and 2 chairs and a set of rough shelves, filled with the supplies of a man who prepared carefully for winter, flour and cornmeal, and dried beans and salt pork, and a dozen other things neatly organized. There was a small room off the back of the main room, separated by a door, and this was where Callum said she would sleep. His own sleeping space, he indicated, was a loft above the main room, accessed by a wooden ladder, and there was a privacy to the arrangement that she found herself grateful for in ways that went beyond the practical. "It is not much," he said, setting her small bundle of belongings on the table with a care that said he understood how little she had. "It is more than I have had in 6 weeks, she said, and she meant it absolutely. She stood in the center of the main room and felt the warmth of it, the solidity of the logs and the heat coming off the fire he had laid and lit, and something inside her that had been held very tight began, cautiously, to release. The first days were careful and quiet, the two of them moving around each other with a mutual attention that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. That was the particular tension of two people learning the shape of each other. Callum went out early each morning to check his trap lines, returning in the afternoon with pelts and sometimes with fresh game, moving through the cold and the high country with a self-sufficiency that she watched and respected. He was not a man who talked much, she was learning, but when he did talk, it was with a directness and a precision that she found more communicative than many men's long speeches. Eleanor cooked because she knew how and because it needed doing, and also because in the kitchen she felt herself most fully herself, most capable and grounded. She explored his pantry and his cellar, which held a winter's worth of carefully preserved food, and she began to understand that Callum Holt was a man who paid attention to things, who planned and prepared with the kind of thoroughness that came not from anxiety, but from genuine care for his own survival and comfort. She made venison stew on the second evening, using herbs she found dried and hanging from a beam in the kitchen, and a recipe her mother had taught her in the warm kitchen of their Illinois farmhouse, a kitchen that felt very far away now and very long ago. She set the pot on the table and sat across from Callum, and they ate together in the firelight, and the silence between them was different from the silence of the first day. It had grown something in it, something small and tentative but alive. "This is good," he said, and looked up from his bowl. "My mother's recipe," she said. "She was a better cook than I am." "I doubt that," he said, and went back to his bowl. And she sat with that simple statement for a moment, feeling its warmth settle into her like the stew itself. On the fourth day, she asked him about the poker game. They were sitting by the fire after supper, she mending a tear in her coat while he oiled the action of his rifle, and she asked without looking up from her sewing, because she had found it was easier to ask difficult things when your hands were busy. "Did you know what you were going to do before you went to the camp that night?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Billy Coates came into town the day before," he said. "He told me what was happening there, what Cross was planning." He set the rifle down on his knee and looked at the fire. "I have played cards with Silas Cross before. I know how he plays." "You went there specifically," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked up then, and he was looking at the fire, his profile strong and still in the orange light, and she thought about what it meant that this man had ridden 4 miles through a November night specifically to play a card game for her freedom. "Why?" she asked. He turned and looked at her, and the dark eyes held something direct and uncomplicated. "Because it was wrong," he said. "Because you were being kept against your will and no one was doing anything about it, and I could do something about it, so I did." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's simple," she said. "That's simple," he said. She went back to her sewing, and the fire crackled between them, and outside, the wind moved through the spruce trees with a sound like distant breathing, and Eleanor Voss thought that in all her life she had never received a more straightforward gift from another human being. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most peaceful she had spent in years. The high country settled into its winter rhythm, snowfall alternating with days of brilliant cold sunshine that turned the valley below into a landscape of blinding white, the spruce trees loaded with snow and the tracks of deer and elk and fox writing their daily stories across the drifts. Callum came and went on his trap lines, and Eleanor kept the cabin, and slowly, in the way that people learn each other when circumstances require close proximity and silence does not feel like an enemy, they began to talk. He told her about Pennsylvania, about a father who had been a blacksmith and a mother who had died when he was 12, about a brother who had gone west first and written letters full of breathless enthusiasm until the letters stopped, and Callum had eventually followed, not entirely sure if he was looking for his brother or something else. He had never found the brother, and what he had found instead was this country, these mountains, this sky, and he had stopped looking for anything else. She told him about Illinois and her mother, about the kitchen that was her education and her sanctuary, about the years after her mother died, when her stepfather's drinking had deepened and his judgment had collapsed, about the day she had come home from the market to find a man sitting in the parlor and her stepfather handing over a piece of paper and not meeting her eyes. She told it plainly, without self-pity, in the way she told most things, and he listened with the same complete attentiveness he seemed to give everything, not interrupting, not performing sympathy, just present and taking it in. And when she finished, he said nothing for a moment and then said quietly, "You are one of the strongest people I have ever known." She was so surprised that she laughed, a real laugh, the first one in a long time, and the sound of it in the warm cabin startled them both, and then they were both smiling, and something shifted between them with the small but definitive quality of a door opening. She began to notice things. The way he moved, with a physical competence so thorough it had the quality of grace, large body negotiating the world with an ease that came from a lifetime of relying on it completely. The way his hands looked when he was working, broad and scarred and deeply capable. The way he laughed when she said something that caught him off guard, which was rare, but when it happened, was a full, unguarded thing that changed his whole face. The way he always made sure her side of the fire was warmer, adjusting the logs without comment, without drawing attention to it. She noticed that he watched her too, not in the way men at the camp had watched her, with a hunger that reduced her to a function, but in the way you watch something you were trying to understand, trying to see clearly, giving it the full courtesy of your attention. One evening in late November, she was making biscuits while he sat at the table working on a set of snowshoes he was repairing, and the fire was bright and the cabin smelled of flour and wood smoke and pine, and she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, something open and careful and warm. "What?" she said. He seemed to consider his words. "I was thinking," he said, "that this is a good thing, you being here." The simplicity of it caught her completely off guard. She turned back to her biscuits, mostly to have somewhere to look, and felt the warmth moving through her chest. "I was thinking the same thing," she said, and meant it more than she could quite account for. December arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days and buried the valley in 4 feet of snow and made the cabin a small, warm universe of its own, sealed from the outside world by walls of white. They were not uncomfortable with each other's company. They had, in the week since Eleanor's arrival, achieved a kind of domestic ease that surprised her when she stopped to examine it, a naturalness to the shared space, to the division of tasks, to the rhythms of the day that felt less like an arrangement and more like something that had always existed and had only recently been discovered. During the blizzard, with no trap lines to check and no distances to cover, they talked more than they had talked in all the preceding weeks combined. Callum told her about the mountains, about the land and the animals and the seasons, about how to read the weather and the color of the sky and the behavior of the elk, about which plants could save your life in the spring and which ones could end it. He talked about these things with a love so thorough and quiet, it was more moving than any passionate declaration she had ever witnessed. A man in his proper place, at home in his world. She told him about food, about the history of recipes and the science of bread, and the ways that cooking was not merely sustenance, but a form of language, a way of saying things that words were sometimes too blunt to express. She told him about her mother's kitchen on winter evenings in Illinois, about the particular pleasure of feeding people well, of watching the satisfaction move through a room she had built with her hands and her skills. She had not talked about it like this in a long time. It felt like recovering something she had not known was lost. On the second evening of the blizzard, they were sitting close to the fire because the cold outside had intensified, and the room's warmth was gathered most strongly near the hearth, and she had fallen into silence looking at the flames, and he had fallen into silence too. And when she turned to say something, she found that he was very close and looking at her with those dark eyes, and the firelight was doing extraordinary things to the angles of his face. She did not say what she had been going to say. He reached out and very slowly, with a deliberateness that gave her every opportunity to move away, tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face. His hand was warm from the fire and rough from years of work, and the touch was so gentle that it seemed improbable from a man of his size, and she sat very still, in the way you sit still when you are afraid that moving will end something. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I know that you have had good reasons to trust very little of what men have told you," he said, "and I know that we have not known each other long. But I would like to know you longer. I would like to know you for a very long time." He paused. "If that is something you might want." She looked at him for a long moment, at the fire in his dark eyes and the earnestness in his face, and she thought about trust, about what it meant to choose it, about the cost of not choosing it. "I think," she said slowly, "that it might be something I want." He smiled at her, and it was the real smile, the unguarded one, and it did the thing to his face that she had already begun to think about when she should have been thinking about other things. "Good," he said. The blizzard ended on the third morning, and the world outside was remade in white, the valley below blazing in cold winter sunlight, the spruce trees extravagant with snow. Callum went out to check on the horses in the small stable he had built against the south wall of the cabin, and Eleanor stood on the porch in the sharp, cold morning and looked out over the white valley and breathed the air that tasted of pine and cold stone, and something she could only describe as freedom, and felt it in her lungs and in her chest and in the place behind her sternum where fear had been living for 2 years. She was not naive about the difficulties ahead. The world outside this valley was still the world it had been. Silas Cross was still out there, and she had no illusions about men like Cross accepting a loss with grace. Her stepfather was somewhere in this territory, probably drunk and probably in debt, which made him unpredictable. She had no money of her own, no legal standing that would hold up against a contract she had burned in a stove, and the territory of Colorado in 1872 was not a place that offered women many robust protections under the law. But she was standing in the clean, cold air on the porch of a solid cabin in the mountains, and there was wood smoke rising from the chimney behind her, and somewhere in the small stable she could hear Callum's voice, speaking quietly to the horses the way he spoke to everything in his world, with a low, steady kindness, and she thought that whatever came next, she would face it differently than she had faced anything before, because for the first time in years, she would not be facing it alone. Christmas came quietly, observed in the way of practical people in isolated places, with a better-than-usual meal and a small mutual acknowledgement that the day was different. Eleanor made a dried fruit cake with the last of the currants she had found in Callum's pantry, and he produced from some place in his things a small piece of blue ribbon that she suspected he had been carrying for reasons he could not explain, and he gave it to her with a straightforwardness that bypassed the embarrassment most men would have brought to such a small gift, and she tied it in her dark hair and wore it all day, and they ate their Christmas dinner by the fire, and talked and were easy together in a way that was becoming as natural as breathing. In January, he kissed her. They had been outside together in the late afternoon, clear weather having held for a week and the snow compact enough to walk on with the snowshoes he had finished repairing. He had been showing her the valley, the places where the creek ran under the ice and the meadow that became something incredible in spring, and the light was going golden and low across the snow, turning everything warm and amber. And she had turned to say something to him, and his face had been very close, and they had both stopped moving. He asked her. That was the thing that she would remember, the particular detail that she would carry with her long afterward. He could have simply done it, and she would have let him, but he asked. "May I kiss you, Eleanor?" he said. She had been called Eleanor her whole life by people who used the word as a label, as an identifier, as a way of getting her attention. In his voice it was something different. It was a name given with full weight, with full recognition, as if he understood the specific and particular person it belonged to. "Yes," she said. He kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything, that thoroughness and gentleness combined, and the cold air was all around them, and the snow blazed gold in the last of the day's sun, and her hands found the front of his coat and held on. And when they separated, she looked up at his face, and saw in it everything she had been hoping to see, and some things she had not dared to hope for. "Good," she said, which was what he had said to her by the fire in November, and she watched understanding move through his expression, and then she watched him smile. They walked back to the cabin in the violet dusk with their breath-making clouds in the air and their shoulders touching, and she thought about love, about its stubborn ability to survive the worst circumstances, to find its way into the cracks in the world's cruelty and grow there like a wildflower in a rock face. February was deep winter, the coldest and most relentless part of the season, and it drove them closer together in all the ways that cold and isolation drive people who are already inclined toward each other. They spent their evenings talking and reading, Callum having a small collection of books that she had not fully explored, a Bible, a tattered copy of Cooper's frontier novels, a surveyor's manual, and unexpectedly, a volume of poetry by William Cullen Bryant that he had carried from Pennsylvania, and that turned out, when she asked about it, to have been his mother's. They read to each other in the evenings, which was a thing that Eleanor had not done with another person since her mother died, and she found it an intimacy more profound in some ways than the kisses they had begun to exchange with increasing frequency and depth. He told her things about himself that she understood he had not told many people, about the loneliness of the mountains in the first years, before the loneliness became a comfortable companion rather than an ache, about the brother he had followed west, a man named Thomas who had been charming and reckless and had gone to Nevada for the silver and had died in a mine collapse in 1870, which Callum had not known about until months after the fact and which had closed something in him for a long time. About the reasons he had stayed in the mountains rather than going back east, which had to do with the feeling that the open country had taught him something about the size of the world and his own proper scale within it, something that rooms and streets could not sustain. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the night her mother died and the particular quality of the silence in the house afterward, about the kitchen that was her refuge, and the way she had understood, even as a child, that feeding people was a way of loving them, about the moment in the mining camp cookhouse when she had understood that her competence had become her cage, that the thing that made her most valuable to others was also the thing that made it easiest to reduce her to her function. He listened to these things the way he listened to everything, with a full and patient attention, and when she finished he said, "You are not a function. You are not a skill set. You are Eleanor Voss, and you are the most interesting person I have ever sat across a fire from." She kissed him then, because there was nothing adequate to say. March arrived with the first suggestions of thaw, the southern exposures of the ridges beginning to show dark patches of bare earth, the creek under the ice beginning to murmur and shift. The world outside the valley began to seem possible again in a way that it had not through the winter's deepest cold, and with that possibility came the question of what came next. They did not have to bring it up. It arrived naturally, one morning over coffee, in the tentative spring light. "I need to go to Hatchet Creek," Callum said. "Sell the winter pelts, resupply." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked out the south window at the pale March light on the snow. "Cross will still be there," she said. "Probably," he said. "My stepfather may be in the territory." "I know." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that directness she had come to rely on, like a fixed star. "I am coming with you," she said. "I was counting on that," he said. They spent 2 days preparing for the journey, packing the pelts, making sure the horses were fit, taking stock of what they needed. On the second evening, while Eleanor was sorting through the items on the pantry shelf, making a list of what needed replacing, Callum came and stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, a carefulness, a tentativeness that was unusual in a man so generally straightforward. "There is something I want to ask you," he said. She turned and looked at him. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and she had to tilt her head back to look up into his face, which she had done 1,000 times over the past months, and which still produced in her a small, private acceleration. He took both her hands in his, which were warm and rough and real, and he looked at her with the dark eyes that held everything they always held, the attentiveness and the warmth and the directness, and now something else, something that was vulnerability. And she found it the most beautiful thing she had seen in him. "I know this is not the way it is usually done," he said. "We have not known each other long enough for what the world would call proper, and I know that you have had good reasons to be careful about what you commit to and who you trust." He paused. "But I know what I feel. I have known it for some time now, and I am not a man who says things he does not mean." She was very still, listening. "I am asking you to marry me, Eleanor," he said, "not because the world expects it, or because it is the proper arrangement for two people living together in a mountain cabin. Because I love you. Because you are the person I want to live the rest of my life beside. Because you are brave and real and extraordinary. And I would like to spend a very long time being the man you trust. The silence that followed was full of the sounds of the mountain cabin, the fire, the wind in the spruce, the horses shifting in the stable, and underneath all of it, the sound of her own heart, which was not quiet. She did not keep him waiting. Yes, she said, and she said it with her whole self, not cautiously, not with reservations. Yes, completely, yes. He lifted her off the ground when she said it, which she had not expected, and she made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. And he held her that way for a moment, her feet off the floor, his arms completely sure around her, and she put her face against his neck and felt the warmth of him and the realness of him, and thought that this was what it felt like when the world corrected its own cruelties. They rode into Hatchet Creek on a morning in late March when the main street was running with snowmelt and the mountains stood clear and brilliant against a sky of intense blue. Callum had 3 months of prime pelts loaded on the pack horse, and the pelts were fine and well prepared, and the man at the trading post looked at them with unconcealed respect and gave Callum a price that was fair and that Callum accepted without negotiation because he knew what fair looked like. Eleanor walked the town with a freedom that felt strange and new and good. She had only seen Hatchet Creek twice before, once passing through with her stepfather on the way into the territory and once in the back of a wagon on the way to the mining camp, and she had not had the opportunity to look at it properly from the standing position of a person who was there by her own choice. It was a rough town, raw-timbered and ambitious, the kind of town that believed it would be a city in 10 years and might not exist in 5, but it had a dry goods store and a feedlot and a land office and a church, and the church was what she was looking at. The minister was a Congregationalist from Ohio named Reverend Harkness, a thin, earnest man with wire-rimmed spectacles who seemed genuinely pleased to have a marriage to perform and asked them relatively few questions. And within an hour of entering the church, Eleanor Voss became Eleanor Holt in front of 3 witnesses, including Billy Coates, who had turned bright red from his collar to his hairline and had pressed her hand warmly and told her he was glad. Silas Cross was in the saloon when they came out of the church, and Eleanor saw him see them, saw the calculation in his expression, and she straightened her spine and held Callum's arm and looked at Cross directly until he was the one who looked away. He did not trouble them. She had wondered, through the months of winter, what form his revenge might take, what a man like Cross did when he was outplayed. What he apparently did, she discovered in the following days through the talk of the town, was move on. Cross had interests in 4 different mining camps and an investment in a new camp starting up in New Mexico, and Hatchet Creek was only one piece of his geography. He was already spending more time in Santa Fe. The loss of the poker game, it seemed, had been absorbed into his larger portfolio of wins and losses and filed under manageable. Eleanor bought fabric for a proper dress with some of Callum's pelt money, and Callum offered, and she accepted it as the straightforward gift of a husband, which was the most natural-feeling sentence she had formed in years. She bought flour and salt and spices and a new iron pot and a length of blue ribbon to replace the one from Christmas that had gone gray with use. She bought paper and ink because she had decided she was going to write down her mother's recipes before they faded any further from her memory, which was something she should have done years ago and which felt important now in a way she could not entirely explain but did not need to. They spent 2 nights in Hatchet Creek at a boarding house run by a capable woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who fed them a very good supper and asked Eleanor sharp, direct questions about the mining camp and the contract that had brought her there, and listened to the answers with the focused expression of a woman who was mentally composing the letter she was going to write to the territorial governor's office. "There are 3 other women I know of who are under similar arrangements at camps in this district," Mrs. Aldridge said. "It is against the spirit of the law, if not always its letter, and the spirit needs reinforcing." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "What can be done?" "Letters," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Documentation. Names attached to the truth. The territory is applying for statehood in a few years, and there are people in Denver who care how that application looks." She refilled Eleanor's teacup with brisk efficiency. I've been writing letters for 2 years. Would you be willing to add yours? Yes, Eleanor said, with no hesitation at all. Callum, sitting across the table, said nothing, but she saw him look at her with that expression she had learned to read over the winter months, the one that was pride and love combined, straightforward and unguarded, and she thought that of all the things she had found in Colorado, this was the most unexpected and the most valuable. They rode home the following morning in early April sunshine, the world breaking open with the first green of the season, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt, the aspens just beginning to show the pale green that would become their famous gold by autumn. The horses moved well in the warming air, and the trail home felt different from the trail they had ridden in November, the same distance but a different kind of distance, measured now in the trust between two people who knew each other. "Are you happy?" Callum asked her, somewhere along the trail, with the same directness with which he asked everything. She considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "Yes," she said, genuinely, surprisingly happy. She looked at the mountains around them, the pine and the granite and the sky. "I did not know I would end up here." "Neither did I," he said. "I'm glad we both did." She reached across from her horse and took his hand where it rested on his saddle horn, and he closed his fingers around hers, warm and sure, and they rode the rest of the way home like that, connected through the morning air. The spring and summer that followed were the most beautiful period of Eleanor Holt's life, though she understood that was partly because they came directly after the worst period, which gave them an intensity of appreciation that ordinary happiness does not always carry. The valley was everything Callum had told her it would be, alive with wildflowers from the moment the snow left the meadows, the air full of the sounds of water and birds and the wind through the aspens. She learned the names of the flowers from him, which he knew the way he knew everything about this country, thoroughly and without affectation. She taught him her mother's recipes and some things she had invented herself in the mining camp kitchen when she was trying to make the best of bad circumstances, and he ate everything she made with the same uncomplicated pleasure she had come to love about him. She wrote her letter to the territorial governor's office, 3 careful pages that documented what had happened to her and named the men involved. She wrote it with the same plainness she brought to most things, and the particular quality of that plainness, she suspected, was what made it effective, because plain truth, stated plainly, is harder to dismiss than embellishment. Mrs. Aldridge sent it along with 4 others in May, and in July they received a letter back from Denver informing them that the matter was under official review, and that Gerald Drum had been summoned to explain the terms of certain contracts issued by the Monarch mining camp. It was not justice in any complete sense. She was under no illusions about the completeness of justice available to women in the Colorado Territory in 1872. But it was something, a consequence, a record, and the satisfaction it gave her was real and specific and hers. She was also by July quietly certain that she was expecting a child. She told Callum on a summer evening when the sun was going down behind the western ridge and the valley was full of gold light and the smell of the wild grasses they had been cutting for the horses. He was sitting on the porch, mending a harness, and she sat beside him and told him in her direct way, and she watched the information move through him. He set the harness down and turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, something vast and tender, slightly stunned, deeply glad. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said. "It is a great deal." "It is the best thing I have ever heard," he said, and she believed him completely. The summer passed in the fullness of a life being built. Callum expanded the cabin, adding 2 rooms against the east wall with the methodical competence he brought to all physical tasks, the walls going up solid and straight, the windows set to catch the morning light. Eleanor designed the interior with the same attention to function and comfort she brought to her kitchen, thinking about the spaces where a child would grow up, the corners and the shelves and the light. Billy Coates came to visit in August, riding up from the Monarch camp, which he was leaving in order to go back to Tennessee, and he sat on the porch and ate Eleanor's pie and told them what he knew of Cross, which was that Cross was indeed spending most of his time in New Mexico now, and that Gerald Drum had resigned the camp foreman position after the inquiry from Denver and gone to California. The Monarch was under new management, a company from Denver with more formal arrangements for the people it employed. "Things are changing," Billy said. "Not fast, but they are changing." "They are," Eleanor said, and looked at Callum, who was looking at her. Autumn came back around, and Eleanor had grown round and certain, and the cabin was warm and complete, and the horses were fat on good summer grass, and the pantry was full of winter provisions. And one evening in October, exactly 1 year after she had ridden out of the Monarch mining camp in the gray pre-dawn, Eleanor went into labor with the kind of calm determination that characterized her approach to everything difficult. Callum had ridden 2 days earlier to bring Mrs. Aldridge from Hatchet Creek, a precaution Eleanor had initially resisted and then been grateful for. And Mrs. Aldridge was there, brisk and capable and reassuring, and Callum was there, just outside the door, pacing the length of the porch with the contained anxiety of a large, physically capable man confronting something that his body could do nothing to solve. Eleanor, in the hours that followed, found herself thinking about her mother, about the kitchen and the warmth and the love that had been passed between them through the language of food and care. She thought about what it meant to be a mother, about the continuation of things, about the small, specific person who was about to arrive in the world and who would know nothing of contracts or poker games or mining camps. Only this valley and this cabin and 2 people who loved each other and would love him. Him. When the child arrived, finally, in the gray hour before dawn, he was a boy, and he was loud and red-faced and perfect, and Mrs. Aldridge handed him to Eleanor with a practicality that did not conceal her own emotion, and Eleanor held her son and felt something settle in her that she understood would never be unsettled again. Callum came in when Mrs. Aldridge opened the door and fetched him, and he crossed the room to the bed in 3 steps and looked at the child in Eleanor's arms with an expression that she would spend the rest of her life trying to find adequate words for. He sat on the edge of the bed, this enormous man made gentle by scale and love, and he put one large, careful hand against his son's cheek, the lightest possible touch, and he did not say anything for a long time. "He looks like you," Eleanor said. "He has your eyes," Callum said. They looked at each other over the baby's head, and 20 years of possible future passed between them in that look, all the mornings and the winters and the springs, all the meals and the conversations, and the ordinary, extraordinary accumulations of a life built together. "What shall we call him?" Callum asked. She had thought about this. "Thomas," she said, "after your brother." Callum went very still for a moment, and she watched something move through him, the grief and the love and the acceptance all at once, and his hand came up and covered hers where it rested on the baby. "Thomas," he said. "Yes, that's right." Thomas James Holt came into the world in October 1873, 1 year and 2 weeks after his mother had been carried into the Monarch mining camp in the back of a wagon, and he was the most welcome thing that had ever arrived in that mountain valley. The following years built themselves on the foundation of that first winter and that first spring in the way that good things build, organically and solidly, each year adding its specific weight of memory and meaning. The valley became a small farm in addition to the trapping operation, because Eleanor had persuaded Callum that the rocky southern meadow would grow vegetables with proper cultivation, and she had been right, and the first harvest of potatoes and turnips and beans gave her a satisfaction that was specifically hers, the satisfaction of having made a productive thing from an idea. Callum took on a second trap line in his 3rd year and hired a young man from Missouri named Pete Garfield to help with it, a good worker who was honest and learned quickly, and who in the evenings sometimes sat on the porch and listened to Eleanor play the small melodeon that Callum had bought her in Hatchet Creek as an anniversary gift, because she had mentioned once, in passing, months before, that she had learned to play as a girl and missed it, and she had known when he presented it that he had been listening to everything, every word, every offhand remark, filing it all with the thoroughness of a man who paid attention to the people he loved. Thomas walked at 11 months and ran at 12 and talked at 14 months in the rushing, breathless way of a child with too many thoughts for the available words. And he had his father's dark eyes and his mother's directness and a personality that was entirely his own, full of the particular confidence of a child who has always been wanted. He followed Callum through the valley with the devotion of a small shadow, learning the names of trees and animals and tracks in the snow with a focused delight that Eleanor watched from the kitchen window and catalogued among the most beautiful things she had seen. She wrote letters, still. She had become, over the years, a correspondent of some note in the territory's slowly growing conversation about the rights of women in labor contracts, and Mrs. Aldridge had connected her with several women in Denver who were building those arguments into something more organized and formally presented. Colorado became a state in 1876, and the process of statehood brought with it a set of legal reforms that, while imperfect and partial, made some of the more flagrant abuses Eleanor had documented considerably harder to perpetuate. She received word, in the spring of 1875, that her stepfather had died in Pueblo of a fever complicated by years of hard drinking. She received the news with the stillness she brought to most things, sitting with it for an afternoon before she told Callum. She felt grief, she discovered, though it was a complicated grief for a complicated man, grief for the father he might have been and was not, for the choices he had made and could not unmake. She allowed herself to feel it, because she had learned over the years the importance of feeling things properly rather than converting them into stone. Callum held her that evening without requiring her to explain, which was one of the things she had come to count on about him, his understanding that sometimes a person needed to be held without narrative, without the frame of explanation, just held, present, and warm and sure. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said. "You are always all right. That does not mean you cannot be sad." She pressed her face against his shoulder and was grateful for him in terms that had long since gone beyond what words could adequately cover. Their second child arrived in the summer of 1876, Colorado's statehood year, a girl they called Clara Margaret, and she arrived with less drama than her brother and with a particular serenity that seemed to be her original temperament, looking at the world from her first day with calm, assessing eyes that would not change as she grew. Thomas was fascinated by her in the way of a 3-year-old confronted with something smaller than himself, at once deeply possessive and occasionally confused, and Eleanor watched her son navigate this new reality with an amusement and tenderness that made her feel her own contentment almost physically. The cabin had become a proper house by then, added onto and improved through 4 years of Callum's steady effort, with a second bedroom for the children and a proper kitchen, with a larger stove and a pantry that was Eleanor's particular satisfaction, organized and full, a monument to preparedness and care. She had planted flowers along the south side of the house, wildflowers that she transplanted from the meadow because she wanted the house to look as if the land had grown it. And in summer, the south wall was framed in columbine and paintbrush, and the small yellow flowers she could never quite remember the name of, but that Callum knew and had told her a dozen times, and which she kept forgetting, not because she wasn't listening, but because she liked the way he said the name. The valley itself had grown in a modest way. A family named Birch had come from Kansas and settled at the valley's south end 3 miles away, good people with 4 children and a work ethic that Eleanor recognized immediately as kindred. They became the first real neighbors the Holts had, and the two families fell into the rhythms of mutual aid that frontier life required, sharing labor at harvest and resources when illness or hard weather made sharing necessary. The Birch children and Thomas and later Clara grew up together in the way of children who have no alternatives, learning each other's families' rhythms and foods and habits with the impartial thoroughness of children, and there was a richness to it that Eleanor had not anticipated. A community being built from first principles. She and Callum took to sleeping with the window cracked in summer because Eleanor loved the sound of the night outside the valley, the creek and the wind and the occasional distant cry of an owl, and Callum, who had slept outdoors for 4 years before she arrived, found no hardship in it. On nights when the summer was warm and the sky was clear, they sometimes lay awake for an hour talking in the darkness, the kind of talking you only do in darkness, the unguarded kind, where you say the things that are too large or too strange or too tender for daylight. "Are you happy?" she asked him once on such a night, years after she had arrived in his valley. He was quiet for a moment, which with him was always thinking rather than reluctance. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said, with the directness that was his most constant quality. "I was not unhappy before, but before you were here, I did not know the difference between contentment and happiness. They felt like the same thing." She lay in the dark beside him and listened to the creak outside the window and thought about that. "You are a very good man, Callum Holt," she said. "You make it easier than it might otherwise be," he said. In 1877, Thomas turned 4 years old and Clara was 1, and Eleanor's mother's recipe book was 300 pages long and had been copied out twice, once for herself and once for Mrs. Aldridge, who had expressed a desire to have it. Eleanor had added to her mother's original recipes with years of her own, the things she had developed in the mining camp kitchen and in Callum's mountain cabin, adapting to the ingredients available at high altitude, at frontier supply, in the particular conditions of a life lived close to the land. She thought sometimes about the mining camp, about the cast-iron Monarch stove, and the small window looking out at the granite ridge. She thought about it without the horror of the experience, which had not disappeared but had receded to a manageable distance, as experiences do when enough life is lived after them. She thought about the women who had come after her, who had been placed in similar arrangements, and she thought about the letters she had written and the letters Mrs. Aldridge had written and the letters from Denver that had, slowly and imperfectly but genuinely, begun to change some things. She thought about the poker game. She thought about Callum's hand setting down a full house on a rough table in a mining camp cookhouse, about the contract he had handed her with those words, "This is yours," and about the moment she had fed it into the fire and watched it burn. She thought about these things, and she felt the gratitude for them as a warm, specific thing, not the frantic gratitude of crisis, but the deep gratitude of someone who has had enough time to understand what they were given. One afternoon in the autumn of that year, she was in the kitchen making the dried apple pie that Callum had loved since the first time she had made it, adjusting the spices the way she always adjusted them, a little more cinnamon than the recipe technically called for. And Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing elaborate, incomprehensible pictures with the good paper that Eleanor allowed for the purpose. And Clara was in her cradle by the stove, making the small sounds of an infant discovering her own voice. Callum came in from outside, smelling of pine and cold air, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment looking at the scene, at his son and daughter and his wife. And Eleanor turned from the stove and saw his face. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the mining camp cookhouse on the night they met. That first direct look, the one she had not been able to name immediately and had later identified as recognition. He still looked at her that way, sometimes, as if he were still in the process of recognizing her, as if the recognition were not a single event but an ongoing one, renewed each time. "Come in and close the door," she said. "You are letting the cold in." He came in and closed the door and crossed the kitchen and kissed her in the unhurried way he always kissed her, with time given to it, as if it mattered, which she knew it did. Thomas looked up from his drawing. "Papa," he said, with the 3-year-old's proprietary certainty. "I am here," Callum said, and rested his hand on his son's dark head. Clara made a sound from her cradle, and Eleanor turned back to her pie, and the kitchen was warm and fragrant, and outside the autumn valley was gold and red, and the mountains stood around it with their permanent, ancient permanence, and everything that needed to be said between two people had already been said, and was still being said, in the ongoing, daily, unremarkable, and entirely extraordinary language of a life shared. There were difficult years, as there are in every life. The winter of 1878 was the worst in memory, and 2 of Callum's horses died, and the Birch family to the south lost their barn to fire and had to be taken in through February, and the cabin that had been designed for a family of 4 became for 2 months a remarkably crowded space of 9 people, with children underfoot in every direction and the stove working at capacity all day and the firewood going faster than it should. But they managed, and when the Birches were settled again in the spring in a new barn built by every available hand in the valley, there was a satisfaction in that too, the satisfaction of difficulty faced together and overcome. Callum was thrown from a horse in the spring of 1879, a young horse badly spooked by a rattlesnake, and broke 2 ribs and spent 3 weeks moving carefully and swearing quietly when he thought Eleanor could not hear him. And Eleanor managed the farm with Pete Garfield's help and Callum's instructions delivered from the kitchen table where he sat working on tack and tools and everything he could usefully do with his hands while he healed. She brought him coffee and sat with him in the evenings and read to him from the Bryant poetry volume, which had acquired by now a deeply familiar patina of use, and he healed, as she had known he would, with the solidity of a man whose body was accustomed to taking the work it was asked to do. Their third child, a second son named Henry for no family reason but simply because the name suited him, arrived in the summer of 1880 with an enthusiasm for existing that announced itself clearly from his first moments and did not diminish. Henry Holt was loud and joyful and physical from birth, a smaller version of his father's energy, and Thomas received him with the magnanimity of a 6-year-old who has been prepared carefully for this event, and Clara patted his head with the ceremonious dignity of a 4-year-old who has decided she is significantly older than she is. Eleanor held her third child and thought about the arc of things, about the distance from the morning in 1872, when she had been loaded into a wagon as cargo, and the morning in 1880 when she sat in a kitchen she had built, in a valley she had chosen, with a family she had made. She thought about telling her children this story one day. Not the horror of it, not with the weight of the worst parts bearing down on their small ears, but the shape of it, the meaning of it, the things it had taught her. She would tell them about the poker game. She thought they should know about the poker game. She would tell them that their father had sat down at a rough table in a mining camp and played his best hand, not for money, but for a woman's freedom, and that the woman had taken that freedom and used it, and that from that freedom everything else had come. It was a story about what it meant to act when action was possible. It was a story about what it meant to trust and to receive trust. It was a story about a full house and a burning contract and 2 horses on a mountain trail before dawn, and about everything that follows when the right things happen at the right moment. Callum came in from the evening round of the stock and found Eleanor in the kitchen with the baby, as he so often found her, and he sat down across from her at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and he looked at her with those eyes that she had known for 8 years and would know for the rest of her life. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The poker game," she said. He smiled. It was the real smile, the one she had been collecting for 8 years. "I still had 2 more cards to play if he had matched me," he said. "You never told me that." "I did not want to worry you." She laughed, and the baby stirred against her shoulder. And somewhere in the other room, Thomas and Clara were arguing with the passionate certainty of children who know they are safe, and Henry made small sounds against her collarbone that sounded to Eleanor like the most reasonable sounds she had ever heard. "Were you frightened?" she asked. "That night?" Callum considered this. "Not of losing the hand," he said. "I was fairly sure of the hand." He paused. "I was afraid you would not trust me afterward, that you would look at me and see just another man making decisions about your life without asking you." She looked at him across the table. "You gave me the contract," she said. "That was not a man making decisions. That was a man handing a decision back." "I hoped it was the right thing to do," he said. "It was the right thing to do," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the familiar weight and warmth of it, the gesture so repeated and so genuine over their years together that it had become a kind of home in itself. The lamp burned in the kitchen window, and outside, the Colorado night was clear and full of stars, and the mountains stood around the valley with the patience of things that have endured everything and still remain. And in the house that Callum Holt had built and Eleanor Holt had made into a home, the small, ordinary, magnificent business of a life continued. They stayed in that valley for the rest of their lives. Callum expanded the trapping operation through the early 1880s, and then, as the fur trade began to shift with the changing markets, transitioned gradually to ranching, reading the land with the same attentiveness he had always given it, and understanding before most men in the district did that cattle would define the next 20 years of Colorado's economy. He was not wealthy in any ostentatious sense, but they were comfortable, which in Eleanor's estimation was the more important thing, comfort being the condition in which people can actually live their lives rather than merely surviving them. Thomas at 15 was taller than his mother, but not yet his father. A serious and studious boy who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and was already talking about going to Denver for school, which Eleanor both encouraged and privately mourned in the way that parents mourn things they are proud of. Clara at 13 was entirely her own creation, sharp and funny, and possessed of an opinion on every subject and a confidence in expressing those opinions that Eleanor found both recognizable and deeply satisfying. Henry at 5 was still primarily concerned with being in motion and making noise, a project he pursued with dedication. Mrs. Aldridge came to visit in the summer of 1883, older and smaller than Eleanor remembered, but no less brisk, and she sat on the porch of the Holt house and drank Eleanor's coffee and looked out at the valley and said, "You have done very well here." "We have," Eleanor said, which was the correct word. "The legislation passed in Denver last month," Mrs. Aldridge said, producing a newspaper from her bag. "The labor protection provisions. It is not perfect, but the worst of what happened to you and the others has been made significantly harder under law." Eleanor took the newspaper and read it carefully, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for 11 years, the part of her that had always known the story was not finished, that there were things still to be addressed. "It matters," Eleanor said. "It does," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Your letters were part of it. That matters too." Callum came out onto the porch with a plate of Eleanor's biscuits, setting it between the two women with the ease of a man long comfortable in a home managed by a capable wife, and Mrs. Aldridge looked at him with the assessing expression she brought to everything. "You are a good man, Mr. Holt," she said. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said. "I am not given to easy flattery," she said. "I am saying it because it is true and because it deserved saying to your face." He looked briefly at Eleanor, who was looking back at him, and then he said, "Thank you," with the simplicity of a man who knows how to receive a thing gracefully. Mrs. Aldridge stayed 3 days and left with a jar of Eleanor's preserved mountain strawberries and a copy of the first 50 pages of the recipe book, which she had requested for a project she described vaguely as being about women's knowledge and its preservation. Eleanor gave it gladly, and then sat down that same evening and began writing more. The years kept building. Thomas went to Denver for school at 17 and came back at 21 with a surveyor's qualification and a quiet young woman named Anna from a Missouri family. And Eleanor received her daughter-in-law with the same openness she had always tried to bring to new things, and found in Anna a person who deserved that openness, steady and thoughtful, and possessed of an excellent practical intelligence. Thomas and Anna settled in Hatchet Creek, which had grown into something approaching a real town, and their first child, a boy named James, was born in 1893, and Eleanor became a grandmother with the same quality of uncomplicated gladness with which she had become most things. Clara married a man named David Cross, no relation to Silas Cross, something Eleanor and Callum both confirmed several times through extensive inquiry before the wedding, a schoolteacher from Ohio who had come to teach in Hatchet Creek's new school and who loved Clara with a helpless devotion that Eleanor found touching and Callum approved of in the measured way he approved of most things, which was after sufficient observation and without theatrical announcement. Henry grew up and stayed in the valley, because Henry had his father's relationship with the land, that specific and personal love that does not translate to other geographies, and he worked the ranch with a capability that Callum watched with the quiet pride of a man whose work was continuing in the best possible way. On an autumn evening in 1894, 22 years after Eleanor Voss had been carried into the Monarch mining camp in the back of a wagon, she and Callum sat on the porch of their house and watched the sun go down behind the western ridge. The valley was gold with aspen, and the air was sharp with the first promises of winter, and the mountains were as they had always been, permanent and clear against the darkening sky. They were in their middle 40s, both of them, carrying the years of that mountain life in their faces and their hands, and the ease with which they sat beside each other, the long accustomed ease of people who have spent a lifetime learning a person and are still finding things worth knowing. Thomas and Anna and their children had come for harvest, and Clara and David had come from Hatchet Creek, and Henry had been in and out of the main house all day in the way of a man who has never really left home, and the house had been full in the way it was always best when it was full, with children's voices and the smell of cooking and the particular noise of a family that is glad to be together. Now the evening was quiet. The family had gone in, the children to bed, and the younger adults to their own conversations by the fire inside. And Eleanor and Callum had come out to the porch the way they always came out in the evening for the half hour of the day that had always been theirs specifically. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which required her to tilt it somewhat given the difference in their heights, and he put his arm around her in the way he had been putting his arm around her for 22 years, fully and without qualification. "Do you remember what you said to me?" she said. "The first night you kissed me? In the snow, in the valley, that first January?" "I asked if I might," he said. "You asked if you might," she said. "You asked." "It seemed the only possible thing to do," he said. She looked out at the valley, now dark and full of the sounds of the creek and the evening wind in the spruce, and she thought about everything it contained, all the history of it, their history, the specific and accumulated weight of a life. "I've been thinking," she said, "about writing it down, all of it, not just the recipes." She paused. The story. Everything that happened, starting from the beginning. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Why?" he asked, not with resistance but with genuine curiosity in the way he asked things. "Because Clara's children will have children," she said, "and Thomas's children will have children, and they should know where they came from, what it cost, what it meant." She paused. "And because I think the women who come after deserve to know that it is possible to come through the worst and arrive somewhere good." He was quiet for a long time, and she knew he was thinking about it properly, giving it the full weight of his attention. "Yes," he said finally. "Write it down." She did. Over the following winter, in the hours between the evening meal and sleep, by lamplight at the kitchen table, Eleanor Holt wrote the story of her life. She wrote it plainly and fully, without self-pity and without false comfort. And she wrote about the wagon and the camp and the cast-iron stove and the night of the poker game and the trail north in the November dark and the blizzard and the first kiss in the January snow and every marriage and birth and difficulty and joy that had come after. She wrote her mother into it, and she wrote her stepfather into it with the same honesty, and she wrote Mrs. Aldridge and Billy Coates and the Birch family and the whole community of ordinary people who had built this part of the world together. She wrote about Callum. She wrote about the moment he had held out the contract and said, "This is yours," which was the moment she thought about most, the pivot point around which everything turned, the moment when a stranger had recognized her full humanity and acted on that recognition at genuine cost to himself. She wrote about it with the gratitude that had not diminished in 22 years, but had matured into something richer and more complex, a gratitude inseparable from love, inseparable from the life they had built together. Callum read it when she was finished, sitting by the fire on a February evening with the winter still thick outside the windows, and she watched his face as he read and saw all the things in it that she knew and loved, the attentiveness, the quiet emotion held with such characteristic dignity, the occasional small movement at the corner of his mouth when she had written something that amused him. When he finished, he set the pages down carefully and looked at her for a long moment. "You are a remarkable woman, Eleanor Holt," he said. "I had good material," she said. He smiled the real smile, and she was still, after all these years, collecting it. Outside the window, the Colorado winter was white and enormous and endlessly patient, and inside, the fire burned, and the story was written, and the two people who had found each other through the worst of circumstances and built the best of lives sat together in the warmth they had made, complete and sure in the way of people who have chosen well and known it. They lived long and they lived fully, in that valley between the mountains, and they never stopped being interested in each other, never stopped finding things worth knowing in the other's company, never let the ordinary days go unremarked or the beauty of the ordinary life go unseen. And the recipe book, and the written story, and the children and the children's children were all equally the evidence of a life that had insisted on its own dignity and its own worth from the morning it was nearly extinguished, and the mountains stood around it all with their ancient and untroubled witness, and the creek ran through every season, and the valley bloomed in spring exactly as Callum had promised it would, and there was nothing left unfinished and nothing left unsaid, and it was enough. It was, in fact, everything. In